Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining. This is Eli Spang with the National Association of Regional Councils, and I'm very happy to welcome you to today's, which is entitled Racism, Health, and the Economy. We are very honored today to have with us Dr. Beena Shramali. Dr. Shramali manages the Community Research Team at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. The team conducts research on the structural barriers to economic opportunity for low-income communities and communities of color. And recent topics of her work include gentrification and displacement, student loan debt, and the role of economic conditions on racial health disparities at birth. Joining the Dr. Shramali County Public Health Department in Oakland, California, launch development to improve health in families, recognized and do countries. Those projects she called the Best Baby Zone. And Dr. Shramali received her bachelor's in economic English, her master's in epidemiology and biostatistics, and her doctorate in public health, all from the University of California, Berkeley. Before handing things over to Dr. Shramali, I just want to make a couple quick notes. There's going to be a question and answer at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please enter it into the question box on the control panel on the right side of your screen. And feel free for those during the presentation. I know it can sometimes be hard to remember everything that's in your head. And so just is going to, and we'll also be distributing the presentation. So now that I have covered those items, I will hand things over to our presenter, Dr. Shramali, to take things and go for it.
Hello, everyone. Eli was breaking up there a little bit, so Eli, can you tell me if you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry to hear that I was breaking up there.
Okay, and can you see me? You can see me as well?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to start by thanking Neil and Leslie for inviting me here today. As Eli mentioned, I work at the San Francisco Fed and I manage the Community Development Research Team. And our vision for a healthy and inclusive economy is one in which all people can fully participate and no one is left behind. And in that vein, we conduct research and we foster strategic partnerships to remove the structural barriers to economic participation, particularly for low-income communities and for communities of color. So today I'm really excited to be here to talk about racial equity, health, and the economy, and what role we play as individuals and collectively to really foster the strongest economy we can, the strongest, healthiest, and most inclusive economy that we can. Before I kick it off, if I start breaking up, Eli, please interrupt me so I know to turn off my camera. That would be great. So as you heard in my bio, my background is in public health, and that sort of is a testament to the really growing need for multi-sector partnerships. So as we look across communities, we know that many sectors have a role to play in fostering economic opportunity and health in our communities. And folks like you who are working on regional collaboration and governments have a particularly critical role to play in ensuring that everyone has access to opportunity in the communities in which they live. And really thinking about how the conditions that you're working to create impact our future labor force, our current labor force, and their access to economic opportunity. So I'm really excited to be here today, to be part of this conversation, and I hope that you'll reach out to me. I put my Twitter handle here, so you can tweet at me, or I have my email on the final slide, so I hope that you'll engage, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer session after my remarks. So today what I'm going to talk about is structural racism, health disparities, and our economy, and then I'm going to talk about understanding and leveraging your own power for racial equity, because these issues can feel really large, and just knowing where to begin and how to think about it. I'm going to share some frameworks, and I recognize that people on this call probably have varying levels of comfort and engagement around these issues. So what I'm trying to do is just set a framework that we can operate from, and I hope that that it will be a starting place. So starting with this definition, what is racial equity? Racial equity is just and fair inclusion in an economy in which we can all participate, prosper, and reach our full potential. And we'll know we've achieved racial equity when race no longer predicts life outcomes. And today I'm really going to hone in particular on health outcomes. And I think this is really critical. I mean, we can all understand that years of life lost that's meaningful. I mean, differences in life loss, these are not small issues. And so thinking about outcomes, these can be multiple outcomes in terms of economic outcomes, educational outcomes, and today I'm really going to hone in on health outcomes. So why am I talking about racial equity? Well, racial equity is central to the SF Fed's mission. Achieving racial equity fits into the Fed's mandate for maximum employment, which is really central to our mission. And if we overlook and undervalue economic contributions of people of color, we'll limit the full potential of our economy. And this is especially critical as we know that people of color are projected to become the majority of the US labor force in coming decades. So how are we ensuring investments in communities to really help us ensure full potential for our economy? And also important to note, racism past and present shape economic opportunity, that the disparities that we see are not simply a matter of individual choice and behavior. They're really a product of a complex and sometimes invisible history that has limited options and opportunities based on race. And many forms of racism, past and present, shape who benefits from economic opportunity. And one way that one shorthand that we often use, and I'm sure you've heard about, are thinking about racism on an interpersonal level. So how people are treated, discrimination that occurs in the interpersonal based on dimensions of their identity that are visible, like skin color. Are outside of the medical care setting. Social epidemiologist Ichiro Kawachi says it well when he says, aspirin will fix a headache, but not having aspirin is not the reason I have a headache in the first place. And you can see this across our country. This map shows life expectancy at birth on the census tract level. And so the red areas are where the life expectancy is between 57 and 75 years, and the dark blue areas are where life expectancy is between 82 and 98 years. And why would we see this pattern? Why would it be that you could drive a matter of miles and see this vast difference in life expectancy? Well, the things in the places where we live are huge drivers of health. Where you live determines your level of access to resources and opportunities like safe streets, excellent schools, economic opportunities, good jobs, public transit. And where you live can also negatively influence your level of exposure to the factors that harm health, like crime, air pollution, under-resourced schools, predatory lenders. So our health outcomes and our life chances are greatly shaped by these factors in the neighborhoods in which we live. whether we live in a community of opportunity or whether we live in a disinvested neighborhood that lacks resources and infrastructure that enables people to be healthy. And I just want to highlight for a moment wealth building through home ownership. We know home ownership is probably one of the most important dimensions to really consider, because in the past it has offered the greatest wealth. We'll talk about a little bit later. So when we think about this distribution of health, this distribution of communities of opportunity, these things didn't happen by accident. And I'm going to talk, let me talk about this slide first. So these things didn't happen by accident. Structural racism is at the root of residential segregation, of economic inequities, and poor health. And the factors I've listed here on this slide are just some of the factors that have contributed to the outcomes that I was just talking about. So one that's really well known, I'm going to talk a little bit more about, is redlining practices, but also discriminatory practices by real estate agents, such as racial steering and blockbusting, more investment in the suburbs and white people moving to the suburbs while people of color were denied access to those places, and greater investment in building out the infrastructure in those areas and less investment in urban areas. And then a more recent example, looking at racial targeting of subprime loans prior to the last recession, there's evidence showing that there are many cases in which people of color received less optimal loans, even though they qualified for prime loans. So when you look at these trends altogether, just looking at the stat here in my backyard in Oakland, compared to a white child born in the affluent Oakland Hills, who would live 85 years on average, in West Oakland, the life expectancy is 71. So that is 14 years. I want you to think for a minute about 14 years of life and what that means for individuals, for families, for communities. This is a very stark and troubling disparity. So just digging in for a moment into this often cited example of redlining. So this is a map produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They started producing maps in the 1930s and 40s. This was a federal agency. And at the time, the federal government, this was a time where they were extending capital for the first time to encourage home ownership. So it was like mortgages were sort of a new innovation. And they were thinking about how do we, how do we reduce risk in this market? And what they did is they produced these maps for hundreds of metropolitan areas, hundreds of cities across the country. So here is one of Oakland, and what they did is they graded on these 4 levels. So green is the first grade, and red is the 4th grade. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Bay Area, right below the West Oakland and East Oakland areas would be the Bay. And so, and the green areas here are the Oakland Hills. And I want you to hone in for a second, see where the East Oakland label is. There's an area right next to it called D18. So just let's look at that. And I'm going to show you some language from that map. So this is the Oakland area for D18. And what they describe here is that there are some favorable influences. So just to be clear, this is documentation from the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation. And they document some favorable influences here: convenience to schools, local shopping districts, proximity to industry, but also some detrimental influences. So infiltration of Negroes and Orientals. And basically, they graded this as a red area despite the favorable influences. So this is a really clearly documented example of structural racism. This was built in or institutional racism that was built into the policies of the federal government. Over time, combined with the practices that I described above, that forms an example of structural racism, how you start to see the combination of multiple factors across different institutions combining to create the conditions where people on the basis of race are faced with many barriers. So when you look today, I'm going to show you this map again, just so you can see. And then I'm going to show you on this next slide, this is life expectancy currently, or some of our most recent data, 2010 to 2012. And what you see is this legacy of redlining and these policies to modern day health outcomes. And this was done for cities across the country. Here is San Francisco. And you can see the historic legacy here of poverty, asthma, poor mental health. And this has been, research produced by the Chicago Fed really clearly documents the legacy of redlining on home ownership, home values, rents, racial segregation, and epidemiologic evidence also provides the basis for understanding the health legacy that I've been describing. So when we think about this history of redlining, home ownership, it represents the greatest vehicle and opportunity for intergenerational health transfer that we've had in the United States. So I'm going to show some data really zooming in on the racial wealth gap. We know that financial well-being is closely linked and intersected with race and leads to poor health outcomes. But really, I want to start by thinking about wealth because wealth is different from income. The technical definition is assets minus liabilities, but really what wealth represents is the ability to weather crises, to invest in oneself, and to plan for the future, to take a breath instead of continuously dealing with the crisis in front of you. So you can think of it as kind of the antidote to toxic stress and dysregulation of the stress response that results in premature aging and poor health. So digging into this, what we see on this chart is that in 1998, Black households had 19% of the wealth of white households, and that this has declined over time. In 2016, this was just less than 10%. And over time, the share of households with negative wealth has declined for both Black and white households. But now over a quarter of Black households have negative wealth. So draw these trends back to the previous slides I shared about homeownership being the main driver of wealth and sort of the systematic denial of credit to Black people and how that's part of the story of the racial wealth gap that we see today. To hammer in this point, income and wealth are not different. Are different, they're not the same. You can see here that this slide shows the ratio of wealth to income by race. White people have 210%, 211% of their income as wealth, while Black people have 39%. And just looking across these other dimensions, even for Black people who make the most money, have the most education, regardless of age, marital status, the wealth gap remains wide. So clearly, this history I've described has consequences on health. I just want to look at some of these national level stats. This one shows the Black-white life expectancy gap through the 2010s, and you can see we've stalled in closing that gap even through this period, which was a sustained period after the recession of economic growth. We were really lagging on closing this this life expectancy gap. And we see these health gaps emerge from the earliest ages, like for infants who don't make it to their first birthday. We see that Black infants, this dark blue bar on the right, infant mortality is 11 per 1,000 births, whereas for white babies, it's about 5 per 1,000 births. And we also see pregnancy-related mortality at a much, much higher rate for Black pregnant people compared to white. And a growing body of research really helps us to understand this point that I was making earlier about health not being much more than healthcare. In fact, what we're learning is that health develops through time and is transferred through generations. We're learning more and more that the opportunities and experiences that one has over their life course, especially during critical time periods of development, such as in utero, in infancy, and adolescence, really shape health across decades and affect pregnancy outcomes and future health and social outcomes. So one's life course is really shaped by one's household environment, but also the neighborhood conditions that people live in. And our institutions and policies really have shaped these neighborhood conditions. And this idea that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, othering or belonging, this idea of structural racism, of marginalization, that's really what is baked into those policies and what has shaped our neighborhoods and our health over the life course. So when you think about this, the experiences of parents are shaped by the context in which they lived, the home, their home as a child, the street on which they played, the neighborhood in which they grew up in, the policies that allowed them to live there or not, the racism and discrimination they may have experienced, and the systems of privilege and oppression that structured the opportunities, political decisions, and institutional practices that created their neighborhoods and the opportunities in them. So from this view, a baby's health at birth is both a measure of this inherited past as well as a predictor of future life chances. We know that health at birth really is linked to people's outcomes, their educational outcomes, their labor force outcomes decades down the road. So really what we're talking about is that we think about babies as being born and they are blank slates, but in fact, babies have our history, this history I just described, in their biology. So when we look now to, thinking about the COVID crisis, we're hearing a lot about disparities here as well. And you can see I've highlighted across these different racial ethnic groups, hospitalization disparities and mortality disparities. And again, really looking at this from the lens of root causes. What is at the root? We see structural factors here as well. We see that disproportionately people of color work in service industries with more face-to-face contact. They're more likely to work hourly jobs that are affected by reduced hours and closures. They're more often working in industries that lack sick time or paid time off, sick leave or paid time off. What I just described in terms of the racial wealth gap, there's fewer savings to weather financial shocks. People of color are more likely to live in overcrowded housing as sort of a way to deal with housing affordability issues. And then lack of health care, medical care, as well as issues around childcare, digital divide, and resources that schools have to allow for distance learning. These factors really are playing a role in, when we think to the future about how we want to be closing the inequities, these are factors at a structural level that are going to make that challenging and are likely to exacerbate the disparities we have in our economy. So I want to, that was a lot of information, and I acknowledge because of the scope and scale, it can be really difficult to think about, well, what are our steps? What do we do about this? And I think the first thing that we have to do is really start with ourselves. We have to really understand our own power and position and think about our own identities and our roles in our organizations and think about how we leverage them for racial equity. So understanding issues around race and power and advantage are essential for understanding how people have been historically excluded from economic participation and what we need to do to get to that vision where no one is left behind. So I want to start with this quote. Sometimes the word privilege can sort of be a lightning rod, but what I really want to start with is that privilege in and of itself is not bad. What matters is what we do with privilege. Everyone has many identities. As human beings, we are hardwired to see difference. And it's hypothesized that this comes from our evolutionary biology as social beings. We're hardwired to think about our groups, who is our team and who is not. And our ability as humans to make connections with people is really profound. And on the flip side of that, the ability to sort of see difference is also profound. So understanding that we're hardwired to see differences is really one really important starting place. And thinking about our identities, there are multiple dimensions of our identities: age, gender, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. Race ethnicity is only one of these dimensions. But because of the data we see, we know that it is the most salient one, because across every outcome you measure, these other factors might play a role, but race ethnicity exacerbates disparities when we parse out the data. So over time, messages about different groups and identities become part of our prevailing culture. Certain groups are seen to have higher value and other groups become the other. So despite our best intentions, unless we're actively working against our instincts to be othering people, we are unconsciously perpetuating cultures of exclusion. So this can manifest unconsciously on an interpersonal level, but these biases also get built into the foundations of our institutions, our systems, our policies, the things that I was describing in that first section. So if our identities that we have, when you think about your identities across these different dimensions, if they align to social norms or the dominant culture, we're privileged in that way. We are advantaged in that way. And if there's a tension between social norms and one's identity, somebody might face disadvantage. So members of dominant social groups have this advantage, and they may knowingly or unknowingly reap unfair advantage over members of disadvantaged groups. This doesn't mean that they are rich, that they get everything handed to them, that life is easy. It just means that they are invisibly aided by the ways that we've structured our society. So members of social identity groups who of other social identity groups may be discriminated against, marginalized, disenfranchised, oppressed, or exploited based on these dimensions of identity. Members of the most advantaged social groups often get to define what is normal or what is real. They get to name reality and determine what is real and correct. Given that we all have multiple identities, one can be both advantaged and disadvantaged at the same time. And I think this is really critical to understand. When you look at all these different identities, one could be very educationally privileged, have a lot of money, but still face disadvantage by having dark skin color, for example. Everybody has experienced being privileged or disadvantaged at some point in their lives. And yet some target statuses like race are more salient because they carry more advantage or disadvantage. So here is just sort of, I mean, these are very complex issues, but giving a little bit of shorthand here for us to think about as a framework. These are some dimensions of power and disadvantage. You can look across the identity types that are listed here on the left side and think about who is disadvantaged and who is advantaged within this dimension. So race, class, gender. Looking across this, it's not always so cut and dry. For example, age could be a source of disadvantage. As we see ageism, people who are older often face disadvantage, but it can also be, it could go the other way, where youth, for example, children and young adults do not have rights, do not have voice, whereas older adults can be advantaged in that way. And looking down the list, I put on a couple to think about that are, you know, not typical, but thinking about, like, if you are left-handed, you know that the world is not designed for you. It's designed for right-handed people. So just thinking about, there's many ways that this can manifest. So the idea of othering is that it is a set of dynamics, processes, and structures that engender marginality and persistent inequality across any of the full range of human differences based on group identities. So those identities I described above, we could cut and slice our identities by these different dimensions, and there is a way that people are advantaged and disadvantaged. So the idea of othering gives us a broader framework to think about the ways that our hardwiring to see difference really affects the ways that people are disadvantaged. So what do we do about this? Thinking about how we can wield our advantages to advance racial equity, it starts by thinking about it. So really doing that deep reflection and thinking about what are the dimensions of my identity that give me advantage and what are the ones that don't? And how can I leverage what I have to create more opportunity and fairness? So committing to really doing that deep work and then really listening with a lot of humility to the experiences of others based on those dimensions where you have advantage and you do not stand in the shoes of people who have less advantage than you. You should be listening very carefully and then talking about it. Get comfortable being uncomfortable challenge others, ask questions. This can be one of the most powerful tools, is just to ask questions to better understand what people are saying. If you hear something that sounds a little off, ask a question. What do you mean by that? Support movements, invite perspectives, exchange data, and then amplify voices. Decenter yourself, support underrepresented groups to speak, write, and teach. And really think about this idea of leading from where you are. No matter what your position in an organization, you might have voice in a way that others don't. And so really thinking about that and advancing racial equity from wherever you sit is really critical. So I want to note, if you're a person with privilege and you could fight a little bit longer, then do it. But if you're a person of a historically marginalized group, we want you to be alive and we want you to be healthy in order to continue this fight toward justice. So this is a quote that kind of encompasses this idea of like, when you really understand and do that reflection of understanding where you are advantaged and disadvantaged, it's also an opportunity for you to take care of yourself and figure out where should I be pushing forward and where can I step back? Because it's really important for all of us to kind of take care of ourselves. So you may be asking yourself as you hear all of this, how can we use this framework I described to build healthy and equitable communities? Well, it takes cross-sector thinking. We need to design for healthy food, for economic opportunity, for safe and stable, affordable housing, for early childhood development. And really, when we think about all of these tangible, practical resources and communities, at the root, we could be thinking about these two concepts as our guiding principles: design for a sense of control and design for a sense of belonging. So I'm going to dig a little bit into both of these. So first, I'm going to start with data from this group of studies from the 1980s called the Whitehall Studies. These were conducted by social epidemiologist Michael Marmot, who was knighted in the UK, which is very cool that an epidemiologist could be knighted. And he did these studies of the British civil service in the 1980s. So it was people, government workers, they all had healthcare, because in the UK, everyone has government-sponsored healthcare. And there were, I think, primarily men in his study. And basically what he did is he looked across these 4 different categories: administrative, which was at the top of the hierarchy, professional executive, clerical, and then other, who were basically like bicycle messengers or people who were opening the doors. And what he found was that for each level down the grade, mortality was higher, even though this was a relatively homogeneous population, all with access to healthcare. And this pattern held for multiple health outcomes and held over time, as you can see in this chart. And these results have been replicated in various contexts and countries across the globe. So what was surprising, I mean, what we would expect is that people at the top will have the best health and people at the bottom will have the worst health. But what was really fascinating and new is that this pattern held for every level in between. And what researchers came to realize was that this was really about a sense of power and control. And Len Syme, who's a very famous social epidemiologist, said he coined this idea of control over one's destiny, the ability of people to deal with the forces that affect their lives, even if they decide not to deal with them. And this concept was expanded to the idea of community control and empowerment, a social action process by which individuals, communities, and organizations gain mastery over their lives in the context of changing their social and political environments to improve equity and quality of life. So when we think about the work that you all are doing and the decisions that you make on a day-to-day basis, you can be thinking about ways to create a sense of control and power in order to create healthier conditions. And the second thing I want to hit on is this idea of belonging, and the idea that belonging can be an antidote to othering. So belongingness entails an unwavering commitment to not simply tolerating and respecting difference, but to ensuring that all people are welcome and feel that they belong in society. So I am going to stop there, and we have plenty of time for question and answer. I'm going to leave with this question. a healthy and inclusive economy, what is your role? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sharmali, for the presentation, and I apologize for the problems that I had earlier with my audio during your introduction there. But thank you again for the presentation. That was really a great amount of information, and it's a very critical topic that shows a challenge as well as a great amount of work that remains to be done. So now I would like to open the webinar up to questions. As a reminder, there's a question box to the right of your screen. Please enter your questions in there and we will pass them along. Feel free as well to enter any comments that you have on the session. We're happy to pass those along.
And I'm now seeing the chat comments about cutting out a bit. So if there's any spot where I cut out, I'm happy to go back and fill in the gap. So please feel free to ask questions about that as well.
All right, well, I definitely had audio problems, but I did just get a comment that said that was one of the best and clearest presentations on equity I have ever seen. Thank you. So it sounds like at least the ideas made it through all right, if not all the audio.
Oh, great. I'm glad to hear that.
I also have a couple questions in about the presentation. Will the presentation be made available, and can we share this presentation with others?
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to share.
Awesome. Yeah, we have a copy of the PowerPoint, and we can send that out to all the attendees in the follow-up email for the webinar. All right, let's see, what do we have here in the questions? All right, one question is, conversations around equity and use of terms like privilege can be politically fraught. What's the first step that can be taken when an audience is not used to this type of conversation?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's such an important one. I think the reason that I approach these conversations with that framework that I shared with you, this idea that we all have advantage and disadvantage, I think it's really important to sort of create more nuance in our understanding of privilege. That these things aren't cut and dry, they're not static, they can change over time. And that it kind of also shares this idea that we're in it together. I mean, in terms of thinking about this topic that I shared, really by not investing in certain communities, by limiting opportunity, we are holding back our collective prosperity and our collective well-being. And so I'd say setting the conversation in that framework, that really this is about all of us, that we are in this together. And then also helping people see that we're not talking about blame, we're not overlooking experiences of people's personal hardship. We're trying to contextualize these dynamics that we're and this idea that we're hardwired, we're trying to contextualize that within a history and a context. The next thing I would say is I've heard this term used lately called racial stamina. And the idea here is that we often think about saying the wrong thing and what that's going to mean, and sort of like the guilt and shame that comes with that. And the conversation is broadening recently for people to think about, how do I stay in the conversation? How do I adopt a growth mindset rather than thinking about, I have to get it right before I can be part of the conversation. I think the goal is to just begin, know that you may make mistakes and that it will not be a crisis. It can be an opportunity to apologize and to move forward. So I think there are various ways that people are conditioned to maintain silence on these issues. But I think there are more and more frameworks and ideas for us to move past that. And so helping people, modeling that for people, acknowledging that you are not an expert unless you feel like you are. I don't feel necessarily like I'm an expert. I know I'm going to make mistakes. I don't sit in the shoes of other people who've had different experiences than me. But acknowledging that, I think, is a really nice way to invite others to participate in the conversation. So there's just a few of my thoughts.
All right, thank you for the response there. We've got another question here. How would you generally describe the respective roles of the public sector and the private sector to address racism and promote equity?
Great question. I think it takes the public sector, the private sector, communities, community groups, as well as individuals. I think we each play a role here. I think in terms of the public sector, we are stewards of public resources, right? And so thinking about how our values manifest in the work that we do, in terms of fairness and opportunity and our collective well-being as a country and pride in our country and our economy, and thinking about in our interactions. I mean, there are ways already that the public sector has frameworks for community engagement to ensure that the programs, the policies that we are working on, that we're designing actually resonate, that there aren't unintended consequences, that we are fully understanding the issues as people are experiencing them. So I think those are a good place to begin. And then the opportunity to go even deeper to ensure equity in our community engagement, I think, is a good place for the public sector to start. For example, these issues can be quite nuanced, and starting with the data to inform our community engagement is a good first step. For when we think about, for example, in the health sector, in San Francisco, I'm part of an initiative that's looking at reducing preterm birth in San Francisco. And what we see are these really stark disparities of Black pregnant people and Pacific Islander pregnant people giving birth early at highly disproportionate rates. And so starting with those groups and engaging with those groups to think about what are the root causes, how do we bring the research to bear, but also the lived experience and value those on a similar plane to really understand how we design programs and solutions to address the issue. That's one example for moving forward. And also understanding that you know, we often say communities of color, but there is a lot of variation within the racial ethnic groups we're talking about. So not all communities of color are racially disadvantaged in the same ways. And even, I mean, for example, if you think about the big bucket of Asian Americans, that is the racial ethnic group where we see the greatest disparity in economic measures. So we know that certain Asian groups are, you know, have economic resources, have opportunities for education, and others don't. And so I think really understanding the nuances in communities of color is really important for the public sector. And in terms of the private sector, what we're seeing right now are so many deepening inequities, and at the root of them, it comes down to the conditions that I was talking about on that slide about the COVID, the structural context of the COVID disparities we're seeing. And I think that the private sector really plays a key role in supporting workers, ensuring that they have the conditions to be healthy in the economy. And we're seeing sort of the outcomes of that not happening right now. And I think it's in the best interest of the private sector to really be thinking creatively about their role. I'll give you an example around childcare. We're seeing in the COVID moment such a crisis around childcare, both in terms of people who are leaving the labor force, and disproportionately women, as well as the loss of these small businesses, childcare businesses in the economy, and what this means for our ability to have an equitable recovery, essentially. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the private sector to really play a role in elevating this industry and moving it from the margins into the center. It's such a critical infrastructure for our ability to work in this country. And so I think we need to align our motivations and our incentives. And I think, you know, COVID is definitely this incredible crisis, and there's such loss around this crisis. And there's also opportunity for us to rethink how we can do things differently going forward.
All right, thanks again for the response to that question. I'll just make one final call here for anyone else who has questions that they'd like to send in. And I'll also say that if anything pops in your head after the presentation, feel free to pass those questions along to us. We can pass them to Dr. Sharmali. And seeing as I don't have any more questions that are popping up, I will close here and give another thank you to Dr. Sharmali again for the presentation that she provided, as well as her answers to the questions. We really appreciate having her here today. As a final note, we'll be posting the PowerPoint presentation slides in the follow-up email, and we'll also have the recording for this available, which we'll get up on the NARC website tomorrow. And then as a few other final notes here, we're going to have another webinar in this series tomorrow at 3 p.m. That is going to be with the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission, and they're going to talk about the work that they've been doing to address inequities in their region. So we hope that you'll also be able to join us for that webinar. And then lastly, yes, if you have any questions, anything that pops in your head, feel free to reach out to us. My email is up there, as well as the email of Neil Bomberg, who has been the one who's put this whole series together. So thank you again to everyone for joining the webinar, and a special thank you again to Dr. Sharmali. With that, we'll conclude things. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.